The snow never forgot the girl. It clung to her skirts, stung her cheeks and bit her fingers until she thought the cold might consume her. She had been sent away like unwanted livestock. Her father's words still echoing behind her as she trudged up the trail toward the waiting wagon. "You're no good to us, girl. A mouth too many. He'll take you for the price of the land note, and that's the end of it." She was 17 and already marked as useless. Her mother's eyes had been wet, but her hands had stayed folded in her lap, obedient and silent. In that silence, the girl understood. She was being sold not for who she was, but for what she wasn't. The wagon rattled north into mountains that seemed to swallow the sky. Each mile took her farther from the farm she had known and deeper into a country where she was nobody. Nothing but a bargain. She did not know the man who had paid for her. They said he was strange. A loner who lived where the wolves sang louder than church bells. A man of scars and solitude, who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words in town these past 5 years. They called him Silas Ward, the mountain man. When she first saw him, he stood at the edge of the frozen clearing, taller than she expected, with a rifle slung across his shoulder and a beard touched white with frost. His eyes were not cruel, only unreadable like river ice that hides currents below. He did not smile when she stepped down from the wagon. He only said, "This way," and turned toward the pines. She followed, stumbling through snow, her thin boots soaking through. Her bundle of clothes was small enough to fit under one arm, and she kept her chin down, bracing for the kind of roughness her father's hand had taught her to expect. Yet no blow came. Silas walked ahead without looking back, his broad shoulders blocking the wind. When they reached the cabin, a rough-hewn structure of logs pressed tight together, smoke rising from a stone chimney, he opened the door and let her enter first. Inside, it was warmer than she had known a room could be. A fire crackled low, throwing shadows across a table scarred by a hunter's knife. Antlers lined the beams overhead. Furs hung against the walls. The scent of pine pitch and wood smoke heavy in the air. She felt as though she had walked into another world, both savage and strangely safe. Silas set down his rifle and spoke again, his voice a low gravel that seemed pulled from the mountain itself. "You'll stay here. Food's on the shelf. The bed's in back." And then, after a pause, he added the word that rooted itself in her chest. "Wife." The word was a claim, but not a demand. He did not touch her, did not crowd her, only gave it plain as if it were an oath rather than a title. She stared at him, unsure whether to cry or laugh. She had been cast away as useless. Yet in this cabin a man she did not know had already named her something more than her father ever had. Still, fear sat heavy on her ribs. What did a wife mean to a man like this? She was alone in a wilderness that showed no mercy. There were no neighbors close enough to hear her scream. She remembered stories whispered among the farm girls. Tales of mountain men who took women like cattle, who broke them to their will. But the way Silas kept to his corner tending the fire, his hands rough but careful as he set a tin pot on the coals, unsettled her more than threats would have. Silence stretched long, broken only by the pop of resin in the flames. She thought of running, yet where? Snowbound forests stretched for miles. She thought of fighting, yet with what? Her body was already worn thin from hunger, so she sat, clutching her bundle, waiting for the storm of cruelty that never came. Instead, he ladled stew into a wooden bowl and placed it before her. Steam rose, carrying the smell of venison and wild onions. Her stomach clenched so hard it hurt. She had not eaten since dawn, and even then it had been nothing more than a heel of bread. She looked at him, half expecting him to snatch it away if she moved too fast, but he only gestured almost impatiently. "Eat." Her hand shook as she lifted the spoon. The broth scalded her tongue, yet it was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She ate until she was ashamed of her own hunger, until she thought he must despise her for her greed. But when she dared a glance, he was staring into the fire, his face unreadable as ever. Later, as the wind howled against the logs, she lay beneath a quilt stitched from bear pelts, the warmth foreign to her bones. Silas had not entered the small back room where she slept. She heard him settle on the floor before the hearth instead. Through the crack in the door, she watched his outline in the firelight. Broad shoulders, head bowed, a man who seemed carved from solitude itself. And in that moment, as sleep pulled her down, she realized something strange. The wilderness was cruel. Her father's judgment crueler still. But here, in this cabin high in the mountains, the man who had claimed her without courtship or vow had not struck her, had not mocked her, had not even touched her. She did not yet know if this was mercy, indifference, or the beginning of something far more dangerous. The first morning she awoke in the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers and the room was nearly as cold as the world outside. Her breath curled in clouds above her as she sat up, clutching the bear pelt quilt close around her shoulders. The memory of the night before rushed back, her father's hard eyes, the endless wagon ride, the strange silence of the man who had bought her, the word wife spoken with no ceremony but heavy as an iron shackle. She rose slowly, expecting him to appear but found him already outside, his shadow moving across the snow as he split logs with a steady rhythm that echoed through the clearing. She lingered at the window, watching. His strength startled her. Each swing of the axe split wood as if the trees themselves bowed to his will. The mountains framed him like some ancient statue, immovable, immense, cold. Yet even in his solitude there was no violence in his movement. It was work, not anger, that drove his body. She did not know whether to feel relief or unease. The cabin was rough but solid, and her eyes roamed over it as if searching for answers. The shelves held jars of dried beans, roots, and smoked venison. Pelts lined the floor. Heavy curtains of fur draped across the walls to keep out the drafts. A woman's touch was absent. Everything bore the mark of utility, not beauty. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. And yet it was more than she had ever been given in her father's house. When Silas returned, his beard white with frost, he nodded toward the pot still hanging over the hearth. "You'll want to learn to keep that fire fed," he said. His words were few, but his tone was not unkind. She nodded quickly, afraid to displease him, and stirred the embers into flame with trembling hands. Days passed, each one blending into the next with the sameness of snow and silence. Silas hunted, trapped, and returned with rabbits or elk, his clothes stiff with cold and his eyes unreadable. She mended his shirts with clumsy stitches, scrubbed pots, and swept the floor though it scarcely needed it, for she could not bear to be idle. Silence was her greatest enemy. In the quiet, her thoughts returned to the farm, to her father's voice, to the sting of being unwanted. At night, she lay awake listening to the wind howl through the peaks, and though Silas never entered the small back room, she was haunted by the knowledge that he could at any moment. Yet he did not. Instead, he treated her presence as if it were an arrangement of practicality, nothing more. Food was shared. Chores were divided without words. Once, when she pricked her finger on a needle and hissed in pain, he crossed the room and handed her a strip of cloth without comment. Their eyes met for a brief heartbeat, and in his gaze she saw something that unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. Recognition. It was as though he knew what it was to be cast aside, to bear a wound that never healed. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, Silas returned later than usual, dragging behind him the carcass of a buck through waist-deep snow. His face was pale, his breath ragged, and she saw at once the blood soaking through the sleeve of his coat. Panic surged in her chest as she rushed to him, though fear still battled every step she took. "You're hurt," she whispered. He shrugged, as though the wound were nothing, and dropped the buck near the door. "Bullet grazed me. Bandits. They're roaming the ridge again." Her blood turned to ice. The world she had been thrust into was already merciless, and now there were men with guns and hunger who haunted the mountains too. Silas stripped off his coat, revealing a gash across his arm where the bullet had torn through flesh. Without thinking, she fetched a pot of hot water and tore linen from her one spare dress to make bandages. Her hands shook as she pressed the cloth to his wound, her face inches from his. His jaw tightened, but he did not push her away. Instead, he watched her with those storm-dark eyes, as if weighing her worth not in beauty, not in dowry, but in whether she could keep him alive. When the bleeding slowed, he said quietly, "Reckon you've got more use than they thought." The words struck her like both balm and brand. She wanted to weep, to scream, to demand why he had bought her in the first place. But instead she bound the wound tighter, her tears silent, her heart a battlefield of gratitude and rage. As the storm raged on, she sat awake beside him, feeding the fire and checking the bandage while he slept. For the first time she saw him not only as the man who had claimed her, but as a man who bled, who could be broken, who might die without her. In the morning, when the blizzard cleared and the sun rose over peaks of blinding white, something between them had shifted. She was no longer just a mouth to feed, nor merely a body brought to a cabin against her will. She was a part of his survival now, bound to him by necessity if not by love. But deep inside she feared that necessity alone would not hold forever. There would come a day when the bandits returned or the mountain tested them harder than they could endure, and then the fragile thread of trust forming between them might be snapped. or reforged into something neither of them expected. The snow melted slowly that year, like a great beast reluctant to loosen its grip on the land. For weeks, drifts remained shoulder-high in the hollows, while in the sunlit clearings, rivulets of water carved dark lines into the earth. The girl, still unaccustomed to hearing the word wife attached to her name, watched from the doorway as spring crept into the mountains. The silence of winter gave way to the sharp cries of ravens and the far-off rushing of rivers freed from ice. Inside the cabin, something else had begun to thaw. Silas spoke more now, though never with ease. He was a man who measured words as carefully as bullets, unwilling to waste either. But in the evenings, after the day's work was done, he sometimes told her stories, fragmented, rough-edged tales of his years in the army, of battles fought in places where the ground was red and the smoke never lifted. He spoke of losing men he called brothers, of wandering into the mountains after the war because there was nowhere else to go. She listened with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, for she sensed these confessions were not casual, but carved from a place deep within him, a place he rarely allowed anyone to see. In return, she found herself speaking of her own past, though it shamed her to admit it. She told him of her father's cruelty, of the way he had dismissed her as a burden, of the moment she had been sold like cattle. Silas's face remained still, but his eyes darkened, and she thought she saw something flicker there. Anger not at her, but for her. He did not say the words she secretly longed to hear, did not tell her she deserved better, did not promise her that he would never treat her the same. But when he reached across the table and set his rough hand over hers for the briefest instant, it felt heavier than any vow. Spring brought work. The land demanded more than silence. It demanded sweat, blisters, and blood. Silas took her into the woods, teaching her which trees bled sap sweet enough to drink, which roots could be boiled into medicine, which mushrooms would cure hunger, and which would kill a man by morning. At first she stumbled, her soft hands unfit for traps and snares, but slowly she grew steadier. Her father had told her she was useless. Here in the mountains, every skill she gained was a defiance against that word. Yet not all the dangers of winter had melted with the snow. One evening, as the sky turned red over the ridges, the faint crack of gunfire rolled across the valley. Silas stiffened, his hand going to the rifle that never lay far from reach. "Bandits," he muttered, her stomach twisted with fear. She remembered the wound on his arm, the way he had stumbled through the door months before with blood staining the snow. She had nursed him then, but the thought of him falling again, of being taken from her before she understood what he truly meant to her, set her heart racing. Silas left at dawn the next morning, disappearing into the trees with his rifle slung across his back. He told her to keep the door barred, to light no fire, to wait until he returned. The hours stretched like years. She pressed her ear to the cabin wall, listening for the sound of boots in the snow, for shouts, for anything that might tell her if death or salvation approached. When he finally returned, his coat was spattered with mud, his face grim. "They're watching the ridge," he said. "Too close. Too many." Her fear swelled until she could not hold it. "What if they come here?" she whispered. "What if they kill us?" Silas set the rifle down with deliberate care. His gaze met hers, steady as stone. "Then we fight," he said. "Together." The word struck her deeper than any bullet. Together. She had never been included in such a promise before. Her father had cast her aside. Her mother had stood silent. The world had named her useless. But here, a man who lived on the edge of the wilderness, who owed her nothing, was telling her that her survival mattered, that she was not alone. That night, she could not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the rafters, listening to Silas breathe steadily before the fire. She realized with a start that she no longer feared his presence. The danger outside, the bandits, the wilderness, the hunger, had become the greater fear. And Silas, for all his silence and scars, was the only shield she had against it. She did not yet know if love was something that could bloom in such soil, where fear and survival twined like roots around every heartbeat. But she knew this: she was no longer the girl sold as useless. She was a woman who had bandaged wounds, carried water, learned to snare rabbits. Spring did not bring peace. With the thaw came movement along the ridges, smoke from campfires where no settler lived, hoofbeats echoing in the valley at night, the faint but unmistakable sound of men laughing in ways that had nothing of joy in them. The bandits were near, closer than Silas had ever spoken aloud, and the girl, no longer simply a girl in her own mind, but still struggling to name what she was becoming. felt the danger pressing against the walls of the cabin like a storm building before the lightning strike. Silas became more watchful. His eyes, always sharp, now lingered on the tree line, the cliffs above, the trails leading in and out of their clearing. Every evening he checked the rifle, cleaning it until the metal shone even in the dim firelight. He set snares not only for animals but for men, hidden traps in the underbrush where an unwary boot might snap a branch or trigger a fall. She watched him, her stomach heavy with fear, yet also with awe. This man who lived by silence and steel had made her part of his world, and now he prepared to defend it. One evening, as the sky turned the color of blood and copper, Silas handed her a revolver. It was heavy in her hands, colder than she expected. "Learn it," he said simply. "You'll need it." Her heart thudded. No one had ever trusted her with anything more dangerous than a cooking knife. Her father had called her clumsy, unfit for work that mattered, but Silas placed the weapon in her palm as if her life depended on it, and she knew it did. He showed her how to hold it steady, how to breathe before pulling the trigger, how to brace against the recoil. Her first shot went wide, startling a crow from a nearby tree, but Silas only nodded, patient, and made her try again. Each day she practiced, the thunder of gunfire echoing across the valley. Her hands grew steadier, her aim truer. Every time she hit the mark, carved into a stump, a surge of defiance burned in her chest. Defiance against her father, against the world that had called her worthless, against the fear that still tried to crush her. Silas never praised her with words, but the faint lift of his brow, the small curve at the corner of his mouth, was more than enough. The attack came without warning. It was near midnight when the first stone shattered the cabin window, glass and splinters flying across the floor. She bolted upright, heart pounding as voices shouted outside, rough, jeering, drunk with menace. Silas was already on his feet, rifle in hand, his body rigid as a drawn bow. "Stay low," he hissed, and the sound of it made her blood turn to fire. Gunshots cracked through the night, bullets tearing into the walls, the door. The cabin shuddered under the onslaught. She crouched behind the table, clutching the revolver, every breath a prayer. Through the smoke of gunpowder she saw Silas framed against the firelight, steady as stone, returning shot for shot. His rifle thundered, and each report carried the weight of survival. Then a voice rang out from the dark, mocking and cruel. "Come out, mountain man. Hand over the girl and we'll let you live." Her heart froze. It was not the cabin they wanted. It was her. The same worthlessness her father had named in her had been twisted now into something else. A prize, a possession to be stolen. Rage flared hotter than fear. She would not be taken again. Not by her father, not by strangers, not by anyone. The door burst inward. A man stumbled through, pistol raised, his face half lit by the fire. Before she could think, her body moved. The revolver kicked in her hand, the crack deafening. The man dropped, sprawled across the floorboards, his weapon clattering useless beside him. She stared at her shaking hands, the weight of what she had done crashing into her chest. Silas turned, eyes burning, not with anger but with something fierce and unyielding. "Good," he said, his voice low, steady. "Stay alive." The battle raged on. Shadows flitted past the broken windows. Shots pierced the night. The smell of smoke and blood filled the air. She reloaded clumsily, fingers slick with sweat, but each time she raised the gun she thought not of fear but of survival, of the man who fought beside her, of the fragile life they had built in these mountains that no outlaw would tear away. When the last shot faded, silence returned as sudden as a blade drawn across a throat. Outside, the bandits melted back into the forest, leaving only the moans of the wounded and the stillness of the dead. The clearing stank of gunpowder, and the cabin's walls were scarred with holes, but they were still standing. Silas lowered his rifle slowly, his chest heaving. She dropped the revolver, her body trembling so violently she thought her bones might break. And then, without a word, Silas crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. It was the first time he had held her, truly held her, and the strength of it broke something inside her. The tears came hot, unstoppable, washing away months of silence, fear, and shame. "You fought," he murmured against her hair. "You fought and you lived. That's all that matters." But she knew it was more than survival now. Something had changed forever in that night of fire and blood. She was no longer just a woman hidden in his cabin, nor he only the mountain man who had bought her. Together, they had faced death and refused to yield. And in that refusal, something deeper had taken root. Something neither of them dared yet to name. The dawn after the battle did not feel like morning. It felt like aftermath. The world outside the cabin was eerily quiet. as if even the birds and beasts of the mountain held back their voices in reverence for the blood spilled in the night. The clearing was marked with violence. Bodies strewn across the thawing earth, the snow stained with the dark weight of death. Smoke rose in thin ribbons from the chimney, carrying with it the acrid tang of gunpowder and burned wood. The girl stood in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, staring at the shape of the man she had shot. He lay half hidden by the brush, one arm flung across the dirt, his pistol fallen inches from his fingers. She knew she should turn away, knew she should retreat inside and let Silas deal with the grim work of burying the dead. But her feet refused to move. It was not the sight of death that rooted her. It was the knowledge that she had caused it. Her hand still trembled from the weight of the revolver, though the weapon itself lay on the table behind her. She could not escape the echo of its thunder, the memory of the man's eyes when the bullet struck. She had taken a life. And yet beneath the shock and horror another feeling stirred, strange and unwelcome, a fierce, unrelenting pride. She had fought. She had not been taken. She had protected herself and him. Silas moved among the bodies with a silent, practiced rhythm. He did not look at her, nor did he speak. Only dragged the fallen men one by one to the edge of the clearing. His coat was torn, his face lined with exhaustion, but his movements were steady, resolute. She watched as he dug into the thawing earth, each strike of the spade ringing with grim finality. At last he spoke, his voice low, rough from the smoke. "Don't look at them like they were men," he said. "Look at 'em like wolves. They'd have torn us apart if we let 'em." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "But I killed one." Silas straightened, leaning on the spade. His eyes met hers across the distance, dark and unwavering. "You lived," he said simply. "Don't you ever forget that. You lived." The words sank deep, but they did not erase the weight pressing against her chest. Still, she forced herself to step forward to help him gather the last of the fallen. Together they dug shallow graves in the frozen ground. The labor heavy, the silence heavier still. When the final mound was covered, Silas pressed his hand against the wooden cross he had fashioned and whispered something she could not hear. Then he turned away, his shoulders rigid, his jaw set. Inside the cabin that night, the fire burned bright, but the air was thick with unspoken things. She sat across from him at the table, her hands folded in her lap, her heart aching with questions she did not know how to ask. Finally, the silence broke not with words but with a gesture. Silas reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was rough, calloused, yet careful, as though she were something fragile he feared might break. Her breath caught. She looked up at him, expecting command or claim, but instead she found only the quiet weight of recognition. For the first time she felt not like a girl sold into a bargain, not like a mouth too many, but like a woman whose worth had been proven in fire and blood. The days that followed carried a strange stillness. The bandits did not return, though she and Silas both knew more might come. Danger in the mountains never vanished. It only shifted, bided its time. Yet within the cabin, a new rhythm began to take root. They worked side by side, chopping wood, tending snares, mending what the bullets had torn. Silence remained between them, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two who had shared the same terror, who had fought back to back and lived. At night, she often lay awake listening to the fire's crackle, her thoughts turning over like stones in a river. She thought of her father, of the farm, of the life that had ended when he had called her useless. She thought of the men buried outside, of the revolver that now rested always within reach. And most of all, she thought of Silas, his scars, his silence, the way his presence no longer frightened her but steadied her, anchored her against the storm of the world. And slowly, with the inevitability of spring itself, something began to bloom where fear and loneliness had once rooted deep. It was not yet love, not yet trust fully grown, but it was the fragile beginning of both. The thaw of spring gave way to the green fire of summer. The mountains, once white and silent, roared with life. Streams ran fast with melted snow, meadows shimmered with wildflowers, and the air carried the smell of pine and earth. Yet beneath the beauty lingered a shadow neither she nor Silas could ignore. The bandits had been beaten back but not destroyed. Rumors reached them through passing traders. The gang had regrouped, and their leader had sworn vengeance on the mountain man who had cost them so dearly. The girl, now no longer thinking of herself as a girl, but as a woman forged by storms and gunfire, felt the tension in every sunrise. Silas trained harder than ever, setting her to practice with the revolver until her hands knew it as well as needle and thread. He showed her where to run if he fell, where to hide if the cabin burned, where the high ridges could shield her from bullets. His lessons were not words of tenderness, but they were words of devotion nonetheless. He was giving her every chance to live, even if it meant without him. Yet for all the fear, life seeped between the cracks. They shared quiet meals at the table, their hands sometimes brushing as bread passed between them. She found herself humming while she worked and once caught Silas leaning in the doorway, listening. His face softened in a way she had never seen before. It startled her more than gunfire had. Then came the night of reckoning. It began with smoke on the horizon. Silas saw it first, his eyes narrowing as the glow of torches flickered against the dusk. "They're coming," he said, his voice grim as stone. She clutched the revolver, her heart steady now, steadier than it had been on the night of the first attack. This was no longer terror, it was resolve. The outlaws swept into the clearing with shouts and fire, more men than before, their leader at the front astride a black horse, his face twisted with hate. "Ward," he bellowed. "You and your whore come out or we'll burn you alive." Silas stepped to the door, rifle in hand, his voice low but clear. "This ain't your land. It never was. You'll not take what's mine." The girl moved beside him. He turned sharply, ready to send her back, but she lifted her chin and met his gaze. "I'm not leaving you," she said. Her voice did not tremble. For a moment silence passed between them, heavy as the mountains themselves. Then with the faintest nod he accepted her choice. They stood together side by side as the first shot split the night. The battle was chaos. Fire lit the clearing. Bullets tore through the air. The cabin walls shook with the force of attack, yet together they moved like two parts of one whole. Silas's rifle cracking with deadly precision, her revolver answering with sharp bursts of defiance. Twice men tried to rush the door, and twice they fell to the thunder of her hand. But the leader pressed on, his rage burning hotter than the torches. He forced his way into the cabin, pistol raised, his eyes wild with fury. Silas grappled with him, the two men crashing against the table, splinters flying. The girl stood frozen for one heartbeat, terror clawing at her throat. Then she moved. She raised the revolver, hand steady now, not from training alone but from love, from the fire that told her she would not lose him. Not now, not ever. The shot rang out. The outlaw staggered, his pistol clattering to the floor. He fell hard, the life draining from his eyes, and the cabin filled with silence once more. Silas slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. She rushed to him, her hands trembling as they grasped his shoulders, searching for wounds. He shook his head, weary but alive. Their eyes met, and for the first time words were unnecessary. Everything they had endured, the cruelty of her father, the endless winter, the blood of the bandits, had led to this moment.